On behalf of the World Affairs Council, welcome to tonight's program. I am Kaushik Rajgopal. I'm with the San Francisco office of McKinsey & Company, and your moderator for this evening. It is now my pleasure to introduce tonight's distinguished guest. Howard Friedman is a statistician and leading health economist at the United Nations, and is currently a leading scientist for interagency collaborations involving UN agencies such as UNICEF, World Bank, World Health Organization, UN Population Fund, UN Program on HIV/AIDS, and UN Development Program, as well as ministers of health and donor agencies. He's an adjunct professor at Columbia University School of International and Public Affairs, and the author of over 35 scientific articles and book chapters in areas of applied statistics and health economics. Before joining the United Nations, Howard ran data modeling teams in the corporate world for a number of years. His most recent book is The Measure of a Nation: How to Regain America's Competitive Edge and Boost Our Global Standing. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Howard Friedman.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you very much for that wonderful introduction, and thank you very much for this tremendous turnout. I really appreciate it. Before I get into my talk itself, I can't help but look around the room and see the flags and think that this is a terrific place for someone coming from the United Nations to talk, given all the history that relates it. It's also a great location because of the fact the whole idea of looking at different countries is so intrinsic to what goes on here at the Council. So with that said, I'm going to talk a little bit about the idea of competitive intelligence. I'm going to start with that. I'm going to relate that to what happens in the book, and then I'm going to go through a few different topics that are covered in the book. Obviously, we only have a limited amount of time here, so I'll cover just some of the highlights, and then we have about 25 minutes for question and answers. So in terms of competitive intelligence, this is an idea that's used in the corporate world all the time. That is, companies examine who their competitors are, what their competitors are doing well, where are they lagging behind, and the companies do that to try and identify what they can learn from the competition. Where are their advantages? How can they leverage those advantages? And where are there opportunities to take best practices from the competitors and bring them internal? Standard practice in the corporate world, not done as much in the political world, but we're going to talk about that today. Now, my book takes a perspective very much from the point of view of the United States and what the United States can do to improve itself. So with that in mind, one of the obvious questions to ask with competitive intelligence is, who's the competition? Now, when it comes to competition with the United States, it's a little bit challenging. I define two criteria. The first one is the countries had to be wealthy. The criteria I used was the GDP per capita had to be at least $20,000. Now, that's enough of a criteria so that the country is wealthy enough to have all the basic infrastructure it needs. It could support educational programs, health programs. And it's important to examine the United States versus wealthy countries because that's a fair comparison. If you look at a developing country, you'll see vast differences, and it's not really as insightful. So wealth is one of the selection criteria. The other selection criteria is population. And I selected countries that had populations of at least 10 million. 10 billion is a threshold which selects the top 1/3 of countries in the world. It's also a threshold which requires that country to have more people than the largest city in the United States, New York City. Now, of course, folks who are sitting there, and I see a lot of people doing the numbers in your head, you still look and say, well, they're still not a perfect comparator. And that's true. The reality is in the world, there is no wealthy country that has a population the size of the United States. And we have to accept that as a limitation. At the same time, we need to be open to seeing what can we learn, knowing that there are large wealthy countries. With that in mind, we've defined our competition. As it turns out, there are 14 countries that meet that criteria, many from Western Europe, the ones that you're thinking about, Germany, the UK, Italy, France, Spain, Canada, the United States, South Korea, Japan, and Australia. We have a pretty large collection of countries. Now, the next question is, so what are we going to look at? What are the subjects? And the subjects we selected were focused on where there's strong data, where we can actually identify objectively which countries are leading. And so the areas we selected were health, education, safety, democracy, and equality. 5 critical subjects to seeing a society either thrive or struggle. So we've defined who is our competition, we've defined our categories. Now, there's a lot to cover as we go through it, but the whole idea behind the book is premised on 3 simple points, very intuitive points. The first one is if you compare the United States to other wealthy countries, the United States is very different. Now, for people who've traveled a lot, that's very intuitive. For people who haven't traveled much, many people are surprised to learn how many of the policies and practices in the United States are so different from other countries. So we got the first point. The second point is when you compare the data of the United States to other wealthy countries, we actually don't do that well often. So we're not always the best. And then the third point goes right along with that idea of competitive intelligence, which is when you're not always the best, what can we learn from other countries? So with all that said, let's jump into the actual discussion of the facts. Now, there's too much to cover in one talk, so I'm just going to hit a couple of highlights in the first 2 subjects and then spend more time on the others. In health, a couple key facts that I think you probably might have heard before is the United States spends 2 to 4 times more on health per person than any other wealthy country. And of the other 13 countries I compared with, we have the lowest life expectancy. For those who are thinking about this from a business point of view, that means you have the lowest return on investment of any wealthy country. And that's a serious issue. But I want you to take that fact and add a second fact to it. The second fact is there was a time in 1987 when the United States had the 8th highest life expectancy in the world. And we've dropped dramatically since then. And this is a theme you're going to hear over and over, which is former outstanding performance by the United States comparatively and declining. So we'll take those facts about health, we'll put them aside, we might come back to them later. In the area of safety, we're just going to introduce a couple of facts. One fact we'll introduce is that our homicide rate is 3 to sometimes 10 times more than any of our other competing countries. A far more dangerous country than other wealthy countries. And at the same time, our incarceration rate is often 2 to 10 times more. In fact, our incarceration rate is currently at the levels comparable to the Soviet Union Gulag days, for those who remember those stories. Let's take those facts about safety and let's put them aside for now. We might come back to them later. Let's jump over to some of the other topics which are very relevant right now. The first one we'll talk about is democracy. Now, democracy is a difficult subject to measure quantitatively, but there are ways to do that. There's measures of competition and participation. The most obvious measure of participation is voter turnout. And as it turns out, voters are far less likely to show up at the polls in the United States than in other wealthy countries. We had a far lower performance than the rest of the competition. Now, voter turnout being low is an indication of many things. It may be that voters don't trust that the system works well for them. It may be that there are higher barriers to showing up to vote than in other countries. It may be some other issues about the process itself. But let's take that as a symptom of an issue in democracy. So we know we have this data point here. The other couple data points we'll talk about come from the World Bank. The World Bank has a series of measurements of democracy, and in each one of them, there's some consistency. Countries like Australia come out at the top. The United States consistently comes out somewhere in the middle. Not the best, not the worst of our comparison group. There's also measures from Freedom House. And once again, countries like Australia and Canada are near the top. In the United States, somewhere in the middle, not doing as strong as we would have expected. This is very interesting because just like in health, where we used to be a leading country, if we think back to democracy, we created the Declaration of Independence. Our Constitution was a leading document at the time. We were a leader in representative democracies. But if you think about it, we haven't made a tremendous amount of change to our structure. the way we elect people hasn't really evolved much over time. In these other countries, they have used what I call more modern voter technology. The leading country was identified as Australia based on a number of criteria, so we'll focus a little bit more on them. But what happens in most of these other countries is fascinating. The voter turnout in the United States is low. Why? Well, one of the reasons is we're actively building barriers. We have a two-step process in the United States. Register, then vote. Register, then vote. And I think everyone's aware of the fact that they're building higher and higher barriers for people to vote these days. In other countries, Germany, for instance, in the UK, the government takes an active role in using their databases to have people already registered, and then they send notification notes informing those people in the household that they're already registered to vote. Please let us know if there are other people who should also be registered from your household. So the government is enabling the voting instead of disabling the voting. Other things that are different in these countries is the tendency towards proportional representation. The United States has single-seat winner-take-all elections, right? So we know how this works. If you go ahead, you have your vote. If 45% vote for one party and 40% for another, and the rest of the votes are mixed, whoever got that 45%, they become the elected official. And the other 55%, sorry. Now, in other countries, the distribution of the legislature reflects the distribution of the voting. That's true for 38 of 41 leading democratic countries, according to Freedom House. So what we're seeing here, this proportional representation, it's a norm outside the United States, but it doesn't get exhibited here. And with that single-seat, winner-take-all election, that technology from 200 years ago that we keep using, you end up with things like gerrymandering, where you isolate certain voters or you spread those voters out so they don't get representation. You also get a tendency towards more and more isolation, more extremism, which we've all experienced and seen today in American politics. Politicians who know they're getting reelected can be as extreme as they want, and they have no need for compromise. This is all a result of single-seat winner-take-all elections. And if we adopted more of a proportional representation approach, we would avoid that. Another best practice, specifically found in Australia and a few other countries, is preferential voting. Many of us are interested in having more voices in politics, but with that single-seat winner-take-all election, it's difficult. But if you could rank order your votes, and so you could vote for a third party and be confident that that vote wasn't going to get thrown away, that would be terrific. So you rank order your votes. Choice 1 is this candidate. Choice 2 is this. Choice 3 is this. If no candidate gets a majority of the votes, the candidate who got the least number of votes, their votes are distributed according to who was ranked second in that ballot. It's a beautiful system. It works in other countries. It could work here. What it does is it enables third parties to have a voice. Lastly, I'm just going to mention a couple of quick items about our Constitution, and then I'm going to move on to some other subjects. Now, our Constitution, it was a tremendous document, cutting-edge democracy for 1789. We've made some improvements, but not enough. There are a few glaring issues that still sit in the Constitution today that we haven't changed. I think no one here in the audience would be surprised to learn that in the United States, we have a system of an electoral college. And our electoral college represents a lot of things, but it doesn't represent a practice that has been impersonated by any other country in the world. Many countries have looked to our Constitution and said, what a tremendous document. We'd like to mirror a lot of those components. Our separation of powers is mirrored in many constitutions, but no one mirrors our electoral college. And there's a few reasons why. Being here in California, I know folks are very well aware of the fact that the number of representatives per resident in California is roughly 1/3 that of those in low population states. So if you live in a low population state, you get 3 times as many representatives in the Electoral College than those people who live in, let's say, California, Texas, or New York. It's a complete violation of the idea of one citizen, one vote. But taking that aside, we also have the phenomenon of swing states. And swing states are a fascinating issue exemplified by Barack Obama in the 2008 election, where he spent roughly $25,000 campaigning in Illinois, where he was pretty confident he was going to win. And he spent $40 million campaigning in Pennsylvania. Now, that really sends a message as to the value of those voters. If you live in a swing state, you're a very important citizen. And because of our electoral college system, if you don't live in a swing state, you're not so important. But here's where there is a lesson that's been adopted. Maine and Nebraska have actually used the idea of proportional representation. They don't do an all or none. They allocate their electors according to how the votes are distributed. And every state could do that if they chose. So there are some lessons internal to the United States. Let's take democracy, let's put it aside for a second, and let's focus on education and equality, two areas that are intimately linked. Education is an important topic in the United States, not just for our present situation, but for our future excellence. It's fascinating for a number of reasons. One of the first reasons why it's so interesting is many who work in education are surprised to learn that we actually used to be the world leader. The United States was an innovator in providing free, public, primary and secondary education universally. Additionally, with things such as the GI Bill, we had the highest rate of college education in the world. Now, for those who are listening really carefully there, I used a past tense verb. We had the highest rate of college education in the world. We're now out of the top 15. That's a pretty big drop. What's happened along the way? Well, I'm going to walk you logically through how people go through school, and you'll see some of the factors that are going on. Starting at the lowest age, people who go to pre-primary school. In the United States, if you go to pre-primary school, you have great opportunities not only to begin your education, but it also has ramifications for lower crime rates later. Children of middle-class families who go to pre-primary school have a 20% higher rate of attendance at pre-primary school than children from poorer families. There's a 20% difference in attendance starting at age 3 or 4. Now, this propagates as you go higher and higher in the grades. That child who started out with a much lower likelihood of going to pre-primary education gets older. They go to primary school and secondary school. Now, if you get to go to a primary or secondary school in the United States, you have an interesting situation. 90% of the funding for public schools in the United States is from state and local resources. Only 10% is from federal. This is different from other wealthy countries. Most other wealthy countries, a preponderance of the money comes from the federal level. What does this mean? Well, it means that if you happen to grow up in a poorer neighborhood, your school has less funding. And what's the ramification of less funding in your school? The building is in worse shape. Your facilities for learning are worse. Your computers may not function. Your textbooks may be old. And, much more importantly than all of those factors, you may pay your teachers much less. And your ability to recruit top teachers is severely damaged. That's at the primary and secondary level. Now, there are ways to compare different countries in terms of their education. One of the easiest ways to do it is they have these cross-country exams. There's the PISA scores, the PRSL scores, the TIMSS scores. They all tell us the exact same story, that the United States is average to below average versus other wealthy countries. Leading countries, such as Korea, Japan, and Canada, do a lot of things differently than we do in the United States. But when you look at that score, whether it's science, math, or reading, you see the United States average or below average. But the other thing that happens when you dig into the data is you see that children who come from wealthier neighborhoods in the United States do outstanding. They outperform all of those other countries. Children who come from poorer neighborhoods, off the charts the other way. Now, you expect some disparity in performance as a function of income. You see that in all countries. But in the United States, the relationship between how you do on that high school exam and your socioeconomic status is much more critical than in other countries. Moving up one level in the United States, you would get 60 more points. In other wealthy countries, 40 more points. What does that mean? That means where you come from in the United States is far more influential on the quality of your education at the high school level than in other wealthy countries. Getting older, you reach the college education level, and we have an average rate compared to other wealthy countries of college education. But at the same time, our affordability is a major issue. If you go back a few decades ago, It used to be that the Pell Grant would cover 3/4 of the cost of a college education. Now it covers roughly 1/3. So your finances in the United States, your ability to self-fund college, are really holding people back from their ability to learn. With all that said, though, we did have some examples of excellence. Korea did very well in education. So let's focus on what Korea does that the United States doesn't do. The first thing that they do, it's very obvious, is they have a much longer school year, 220 days of school. The United States does not have a national standard, back to the separation of federal and state, but most states average around 180 days. And 180 days versus 220, you can learn a lot more in 40 days of school, plus you don't forget so much in that 2.5 months that you have off. So the longer length of school is a very important factor. Other important factors are Korea. All of the teachers come from the top 1/3 of their college class. The top students, they pay them very well, twice the GDP per capita. It's a very prestigious position, and they invest in their teachers as they continue to grow and learn. So your teachers have a very low turnover rate, roughly 1% per year. In the United States, we don't pay our teachers well, roughly GDP per capita, despite all the investment that teacher had in their education. Not only do they not get paid well, but at the same time, it's not the prestigious position it used to be. We can all read in the newspapers all of the attacks in the United States against teacher unions. It doesn't have that level of prestige. There's not the same level of investment in the teacher. And at the same time, their turnover rates are very high. So we're seeing a fundamentally different approach in Korea than the United States. Oh, by the way, decades ago, teachers used to be well-paid positions in the United States. In the 70s, teachers got paid roughly 175% of the GDP. So we're seeing a trend here. All of this plays into a lot of factors that we're going to talk about in the equality. So we've established some issues here. The United States used to be the best, declining performance in a few areas. Lessons learned, in this case in the education, Korea has a number of best practices that we could adopt here in the United States. But let's move on to equality, because this is an area that I think a lot of people are paying attention to right now. Now, equality is an interesting topic because there's so many aspects of it. There's income, there's wealth, there's socio-economic mobility, there's gender equality, so many aspects to talk about. Today, we'll just talk about a couple. Income inequality, well, you can talk about pre-tax and adjustment or post-tax and adjustment, doesn't really matter. You'll get the same answer, which is the United States has a higher level of inequality than other wealthy countries. The good news is it's very consistent. The bad news is it's very consistent. But the other thing that's so interesting about the inequality in the United States is not just that it's been growing, not just that it's been getting much worse over the last few decades, but that not every wealthy country in the world has seen that trend. A lot of economists try to describe the situation as being just a function of globalization. It's completely out of our control. That's what they say, but it's not true. In our comparison group of the 13 other countries, 4 of them saw increasing equality, not increasing inequality. And that means that the government has a role to play, depending on what its perspective is in terms of inequality. We'll take those facts, we'll put them aside for now. Related to income, of course, is wealth. That's a cumulative function. So it wouldn't surprise you to learn that the United States has a much higher level of wealth inequality than these other countries. That just follows logically. And of course, it's related to things like our tax laws, where people are able to inherit a larger percentage of the money from estates. So we have a higher level of wealth inequality. In fact, it's so extreme that the 2 wealthiest Americans in the United States, Bill Gates and Warren Buffett, have more wealth than the bottom 40% of America. Let's take wealth, let's put it aside for a second. Let's focus on social mobility, the equality of opportunity, because this is the one that always touches me the most. Growing up in the United States, being told about us being the land of opportunity, the American dream that you can start from anywhere and rise, that's something that we were all brought up with. Now, the interesting thing about this whole idea of social mobility is Americans believe it in their hearts. When you look at world value surveys, It's very consistent. Americans have a greater faith that their country is a meritocracy than any other wealthy country. We believe it strongly. We also strongly believe, according to these world value surveys, that the people who are wealthy because they earned it, and people who are poor because they did not earn their money. We believe this strongly. It comes out in our surveys. At the same time, though, because our faith is so strong in meritocracy, we tend to have far lower social support than other wealthy countries. They go hand in hand. The logic is perfect. But there's a little bit of a gap there. And the gap is the fact that in the United States, we have less, not more, social mobility than any other wealthy country. We are not this area where if you start from anywhere, you have a better chance of rising. You can rise. Given enough talent, enough hard work, and enough luck, you can rise from anywhere to wherever you aspire to go. But the odds of you moving are less than in other countries. And let me give you some numbers so you can see this. If you line up people by their income, the lowest 20% we'll refer to as the poorest quintile. The wealthiest 20% we'll call the wealthiest quintile. Americans who are born in the poorest quintile have a over 40% chance of staying in that quintile. They're stuck. What about the other countries? Well, as it turns out, the odds are in the 20 up to 30% chance that they will stay there. That is, it's far more likely in other countries that you will leave that poorest quintile. What about the American dream? That is going from the poorest to the wealthiest. The United States has the lowest rate of any of the comparator countries. So, instead of talking about the American dream of social mobility, we need to rephrase that the American myth of social mobility, and we need to do something about it. And what do we do about it? It's the education, because education and educational opportunities are the key to the social mobility. I'm going to take that example again, and we're going to layer in the education. If you're born in that poorest quintile and you get a college degree, the chance of you staying in that poorest quintile is 16%, 1/6. That is 84% escape. If you don't get a college degree, the chance of you staying in that poorest quintile are approximately 50%. You're going to be stuck there. So education is a key. But we've seen we have a lot of challenges in providing equal opportunities for education. As we saw, pre-primary, there's already a 20% difference, and we need to adjust for that. Later on, when you get to primary and secondary school, you have this huge difference in terms of the funding at the local levels. So if you're poorer, you are more disadvantaged. We need to aggressively pay attention to that and adjust for it. And then when you get to the tertiary level, we used to make college affordable. We've abandoned that responsibility with our coverage of our Pell Grants, and we need to get back to that. So we've seen a lot of interesting factors here, things that relate to our democracy, things that relate to our education, things that relate to our equality. What we'd like to do is understand now, so why don't we make changes? After all, the data is clear. It's obvious. And for those who take a look at the book, what you'll see is the links are right there. You can follow the data to the original source. So the data is clear. But why aren't we making changes? Well, there's a lot of barriers to change. I'm just going to mention 4 of them right now. The first one is awareness. Now, the good news, everyone in the room here is going to certainly be aware of the data. But a lot of Americans aren't. They're not aware of the fact that we don't perform the best because politicians don't like to say that. In all of the healthcare debates, rarely did anyone point out the fact that we have the lowest return on investment of health. The phrase that we kept hearing was, it's the best system. And it is, for those who can afford it. We have the best hospitals in the world. We truly do. We have the best medical schools. So for those who can afford it, we have excellence. But for the public system, it's not so good. For education, it's the same way. We have the best colleges and universities and graduate schools in the world. For those who can afford it, it truly is. But the public system is behind. Extremes of excellence paired with a public system that's not working anywhere near as well. So, awareness of the facts is the first issue. The second one is complacency. Our decline in performance did not happen overnight. We did not have a flip the switch and suddenly the quality of our education dropped. We didn't have a flip the switch and the quality of our health declined. Everything has been gradual. And so, people don't notice it much. The other thing, of course, to pay attention to is the fact that we are a wealthy country. people are not dying in the streets, and so they're not angry about the situation. So complacency is the second issue. The third issue is our political system itself, and that's why I mentioned a few things about democracy. Our political system is less open to change than many other systems. An example of that, tied to inequality, is the fact that statistical studies have shown that there is zero responsiveness of our national legislature to the needs of the people in the poorest third of socioeconomic class, while it's highly responsive to those in the top third. So our democratic system is a third barrier. And the fourth one that we have to be aware of is the fact that many groups have profited from our current system. Whether you talk about health, education, safety, democracy, or equality, and those groups, they are going to do their best to defend the status quo. So for those who recognize that we have issues, for those who see that we also have advantages, we have these leading colleges, universities, graduate schools, leading hospitals, great innovation, and tremendous opportunities for entrepreneurship. For those who see our competitive advantages and want to use those competitive advantages, at the same time, you have to recognize that in order to take advantage of our competitive intelligence, you have to, at the same time, fight the status quo and those who've benefited. So those are four factors, barriers to change, that those who want to implement change have to recognize. With that said, I want to summarize it by recognizing that the competitive intelligence shows a lot of things. It shows declining performance. It shows areas where we can learn lessons from other countries, but it also shows some leading areas, and I just mentioned them. Leading areas in terms of education at the tertiary level, graduate school level, leading areas in terms of innovation, in terms of our medical systems, our best hospitals, our research, our technology, our entrepreneurship. Our strategy needs to be to leverage those competitive advantages while at the same time using the lessons learned to support our public system where we're not doing as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Howard, for a thought-provoking and fact-based set of comments. I have a broad range of questions here. I'd like to start with a couple of questions on the nature of the exercise that you undertook for the book, and then go to some specific questions about the topics you covered. Why don't we start with this one? We all know why ranks matter to companies. Why does a rank matter to a country? And what does it mean to a country's citizens?
Okay, so first of all, that's a tremendous question. Absolute values are important. The United States' life expectancy now is slightly higher than it was previously. So the overall value is getting better, but ranks are important because it indicates where there are opportunities to improve. It'll show you areas where you can get better. Now, there's, of course, many other factors you have to examine, but it's a way of indicating where you have opportunities to leverage or potentially leverage information from other countries. So I use it in that respect. The framework that I describe of using competition, it's a metaphor. At its core, it's okay if we're not the best ranked, because that's an opportunity for us to leverage information from other countries.
You talked quite a bit about averages versus distributions. How would the U.S. compare in your exercise if it were only represented by the top one-third wealthy states, and conversely by the bottom one-third wealthy states?
I'll answer that, but at the same time, the answer will be true for any single country. If you select the wealthiest component of any country in our comparison group, they will outperform the rest. There's a reason why that's not a fair comparison. But with that question asked, what you'll see is that, yes, the wealthiest parts of the United States will do, on average, much better. So there's a huge disparity in education. There's a huge disparity in life expectancy across the United States. Some of it correlates with wealth. Some of it correlates with other factors. Other things, though, such as our socioeconomic mobility and our democracy, are nationwide. And so it's irrelevant to that. But in general, comparing those who are the elites of one country to those that's the average of another is an unfair comparison, and you'll always end up, quote-unquote, looking good.
As an increasing number of emerging nations join the club of richer countries, for example, Indonesia, Malaysia, India, Turkey, etc., Do you foresee measuring more data from these nations in your models for similar future exercises to compare with the US? And which of these countries are on the rise to be included in your basket of comparison?
Well, I'm certainly open to publishing a second book in 5 years, provided we have sufficient sales of the first one. I'll give you a more complete answer. In terms of expanding it, seriously, it's a question of really making sure that you have a reasonably fair comparison. There's a reason why middle-income countries weren't included. You listed, for instance, Indonesia, Malaysia. Their GDP per capita is much lower. And that's a rough measure, but it's a rough measure that indicates somewhat of the wealth of the country and its ability to support these practices. It's also important to note that even in the comparison I did, not all countries were equal. The median GDP per capita of the United States is much higher than some of the countries included, and some of the countries are recently wealthy. Countries like Korea, they were developing countries only 30 years ago, and so they've made a fast rise, whereas other countries like the Netherlands and the UK have been wealthy for decades, and so they had more time to build their infrastructure. So the comparison really reflects a snapshot of today. If I did the snapshot 10 years from now, there'd be a few more countries in the club, and I think it would be great to see what else we could learn from those new countries in the club.
2 questions on dimensions of comparison you did not mention. The first is about military strength. Where does military might factor into your rankings?
So, yeah, I didn't mention it in the talk. It's actually in the book. The military is a very complicated topic because when you talk about health or education, how one particular country approaches improving its system doesn't dramatically impact another country. In the specific area of military, the United States' approach to how it treats its military and its perception of itself in the world impacts the military expenditure of every other comparison country. Our position in NATO impacts the amount of investment that European countries make. The United States makes a far, far higher investment. In fact, we spend roughly half of the world's investment on the military comes from the United States. While we make that massive investment, many of the Western European countries are making a comparably less. At the same time, if you look at, for instance, Japan and South Korea, we have tens of thousands of troops stationed there. The United States is expending significant amounts of money to maintain those troops there. And while we receive some compensation for from those countries in return, that does impact the military expenditure that those countries have to make. So it's the one area that I studied in the book where actions by the United States directly impact those of the other countries.
And a second dimension, how do the countries you measure compare on gender equality? And does any discrepancy correlate with the other issues?
So for gender equality, it's a very complicated topic because there's not one dimension. When you talk about gender equality, you have areas such as the economic components, the workforce participation, as well as the percentage of salary ratio. In those areas, the United States does reasonably well. You have some extreme countries. The Asian countries tend to be off the charts negatively in terms of workforce participation and salary. You have exceptions like Italy, where for the women who work, they generally earn exactly the same as men. But overall, in that specific aspect, the United States does reasonably well. But in the political participation, which is very relevant right now, what we see is the United States has a much lower representation of women in its national legislature than almost any other wealthy country. Now, the Asian countries tend to do very low, but if you look at the European countries, Canada, Australia, they tend to have much higher rates than the United States.
A question about trends instead of point-in-time comparisons. How does the GDP per capita trend in the U.S. compare with our peers, especially Europe and Canada?
So I didn't look at the trends that much, so I don't want to talk too much about this. What I'd rather just mention is that the GDP per capita as a measure I used as a selection criteria, and I did mention the fact within the book that not all countries are equal. Many have been wealthy for a while, some are newly wealthy, and so they're somewhat disadvantaged. But if we look at a global time period, I didn't take snapshots over decades of it, so I'd rather move on.
You have some specific questions on the areas that you mentioned, including education, healthcare, political participation. On education, can you talk a little bit about structural changes that may be needed to the educational system that other commentators have talked about? For example, the fact that American school days are modeled on an agrarian calendar.
So I can talk about it a little bit. Interesting, I was reading some articles that were saying that that's apparently a myth. I don't know if it's true. I'm not an expert on agrarian calendars. But the first thing to talk about with regard to the length of the school year is this is a recommendation that has been coming up at the national level since the 1980s. Every president champions themselves as the education president, and we've all seen these programs. In each one includes a recommendation on lengthening the school year. There's a lot of advantages to that, mostly because for anyone here who's been a teacher, it's the question of how much you forgot over the summertime, where students are set back months. So there's something to that, just sheer presence. Now, when you also look at other measures such as hours of education, what you see is the United States seems to have much higher hours, but they're not necessarily active hours of learning. So you have to be careful about taking that data and not overly interpreting it.
Question about healthcare statistics. You talked about life expectancy in particular. Are there other healthcare statistics that you studied, and what can we glean from those?
I talked about life expectancy because to me that's the fastest snapshot, and it's not a particularly powerful statistic from the U.S. point of view. We come off looking quite poorly. The other metrics that I looked at in the book start by looking at life. So infant mortality, where we do quite poorly. We have the highest rate of infant mortality. But then as you talk about infant mortality, you have the process of giving birth. That's the maternal mortality ratio, where once again we have the highest rate of maternal mortality ratio. And then you start looking beyond that to the question of amenable mortality. So what mortality could be prevented by the healthcare system, where once again we have the highest rate. And in fact, when you start going piece by piece through it, I then look at things such as non-communicable disease mortality and communicable disease and injury. And for each one of these, we tend to do poorly. Non-communicable diseases is what dominates in all wealthy countries, and we do poorly there. Injuries, we do poorly. Communicable diseases, average, but that's a small factor. Most of the mortality is related to non-communicable diseases, and that's where we really do poorly.
An observation and a question. On voting participation, there is an observation that Australia, among other countries, has a penalty if you do not vote. Can you talk generally about the role of incentives and penalties in addition to structures on political participation?
So it's a terrific question there. There are a couple of countries that do have what's called mandatory participation rules. Belgium has one. Australia has one. I'm not a proponent of them, but they do work. Carrots and sticks. In this case, it's a pretty hard stick. If you don't show up to the voting poll, then you get a fine. I don't think that that's a solution that would work in the United States simply because as Americans, we do believe that not voting is still a choice. And so, in the recommendations that I make in the book, I very much try to distinguish practices that are implementable in the United States and practices that just won't work here. And to me, that's a practice that may work in other countries. It was more universal previously. Other countries used to have it and have eliminated it, and I think that just doesn't work in the United States. It doesn't fit our mentality.
There's a follow-up question to the question on military might. Are the large U.S. military expenditures part of the reason we're falling behind?
Oh, that's a loaded question. Realistically, you have to look at it from the perspective of you have a finite budget and you make choices about how you spend it. I would say in the area of education, and this is going to disappoint, I think, a lot of the audience, the answer is no. We spend more on education than any other wealthy country. We're just not spending it well. So in education, I think it's restructuring how we spend it. For military expenditures, there's something to do with that. That's certainly related to some of our equality factors. But for the military, it's not just how much you're spending, it's how you're spending it. For instance, in the military, there's a rampant amount of no-bid contracts that are occurring, and there's no justification for that. No-bid contracts are an invitation to get ripped off. Everybody knows that. The other thing to note about the military is our rampant use of contractors in general. When you spend as much as we do, there's no reason why our military can't feed itself or manage its supply lines. And then the last thing with the military that's worth reflecting on is we made a decision going back in the last 10 years to fund wars by pretending that we're not funding them. In the history of the United States, we always implemented a tax to pay for wars. And that tax served a purpose. It raised to people's consciousness, even if you weren't fighting and even if you didn't have a family member fighting, that there was something going on overseas. And in the last 10 years, we did something very different. We implemented wars and did tax cuts. And that, I think, is a fundamental issue in not only how we approach balancing our federal budget, but at the same time how we think about our military, or in this case, perhaps don't think about our military.
Are you ready for another loaded question?
Give it to me.
It seems that the financial burden of our healthcare system and the cost to address potential disasters have the potential to bankrupt our government and seriously impede our ability to compete. What do you think?
So I think that there are opportunities that we have to face, but I don't think bankrupting our government is at all realistic. The first thing you have to realize is when you print the money, you can't get bankrupt. Right, that's just a fundamental fact that actually happens. So those who think that you run out of money, they're really kind of just playing a scare tactic with you. But let's move on further and ask the question of how do you control these expenses? So that's the more fundamental question. And controlling the expenses, that's where you have to raise the fact that you have a situation where not only does demand exceeds supply, but you also have very different health system in the United States than other wealthy countries. And what I mean by that is in other wealthy countries, basic health care is considered a right. Being here at the Council, it's ironic because the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, which was signed by the United States, includes a statement on the right to basic health. That perspective is one that's very different in America versus other countries. And it's our for-profit healthcare system that is driving our expenses so much higher for health than in other systems. The for-profit health system is not going away. Once again, that's my fourth point. The barriers have changed. That will stay. That's part of America, and it's not going to change. But it's a question of how you can work within that system to have far more cost-efficient and cost-effective systems. And I'll give you just one quick example. So recommendations were put out not too long ago to reduce the use of mammograms and to reduce the use of prostate screening tests. Why? Because it turns out they're not very accurate and they're not cost-effective. What we need to see as a nation is, do we actually implement them, or do we keep doing the testing because doctors like it, they make money, patients like it because they feel better, and insurers know that they can keep raising your premiums? That's a choice that as a country we need to decide is, do we follow cost-effective measures, or do we continue down this road of exploding health costs? But we have control of making some of these decisions.
What other countries in your research have similarly high levels of inequality?
In terms of inequality, we do have the highest. There is a tendency for English system countries to have higher inequality. So the UK has a higher level than other countries such as Germany or Italy. It's important to note that inequality of opportunity is not measured as universally as income inequality. Income inequality is measured for all countries. But the socioeconomic mobility, you only have a sample of countries because it requires a lot more study and data. But overall, there's a tendency that countries that can trace themselves back to the UK tend to have higher levels of inequality than countries that came from other cultural backgrounds.
Final question specific to a topic. How can America improve the sense of civic duty? How can America improve civic education to drive voter turnout and political participation?
Well, that's a tremendous question. I think that we've seen pulses in the past. If you look at the history of the United States, here you're targeting the question of voter participation. And we've seen voter drives in the past, and they're usually driven by a reaction to something. There was a huge voter drive going on in the 60s. It was a reaction to a recognition of issues with civil rights. Voter drives happened during the Progressives era as a reaction to the high levels of income inequality. I expected, and perhaps I was wrong, I expected there to be a strong drive in this upcoming election for people to get out and have a voice and make sure that they are voting, because the reality is votes count. Even with all the flaws that I mentioned about our system, your vote does count. And people who recognize that, and as you stare at the candidates and you recognize that they do represent different points of view, I expected, and I do hope to see, passion in the streets. And passion in the streets can take different political forms, whether that's people from Tea Party, Occupy Wall Street. Either way, it's passion, it's people trying to have a voice. So to the extent that people can get involved, I suggest they do.
So shifting gears from questions about specific topics to questions about recommendations you have for addressing the challenges. What are the areas where the U.S. can improve significantly with relatively manageable changes? What should we attempt to address first?
Well, my recommendations all started from the data itself, and it's important to kind of reflect on the process that I went through, and then we can talk about a few of the actual implementable ones. The process that I followed was starting with the data, identifying leading countries, lagging countries, and then from the leading countries, what are the practices that they're implementing that allow them to lead? In terms of what could be implemented first, the reality is changes to our democracy probably will take a while, and we have to reflect on that fact. Moving to proportional representation, it takes one single federal law, but it's going to be a tough federal law to pass. Revising our electoral college, that takes a change to the Constitution. That's probably not going to happen anytime soon. At the same token, states choosing to allocate electors using proportional representation could happen, but that takes a very bold state to do that because they lose some power. So I think the democracy changes will take a while. The educational changes, they're going to take some time too, because they require us to make some conscious choices. The one that I think really can be implemented in the short term are the ones related to health, because we have an opportunity. The door is open to having a much better health system. And so we have to recognize that while changes that are opening that door enable longer life expectancy, that was half of the ROI equation, the other half of the return on investment equation is we have to make conscious choices about controlling that cost. But we can. Flip side of the coin, the responsibility of health is not just on the system. It's on Americans themselves. We have an obesity rate that exceeds 30%. Some of the comparative countries had low single digits. And what's the difference? We consume approximately 1,000 calories more than many other wealthy countries. That's more than a Big Mac a day plus. What does that mean? That means our health system needs to make some changes, but we Americans need to make changes too. And I think that is a change that's very amenable. It can be done. The other thing that I was going to mention is in the equality section, which is there are lots of factors that drive equality. Some of them are from corporate governance, standards, and norms, and some of them are driven by tax laws. So if as a nation we want to drive to an area where we have less inequality, that's nothing more than the ability for us to drive changes in legislation. How do changes in legislation happen? By changing the legislators.
What are examples of other countries that made significant positive changes in the areas you studied, and what can we learn from the process of making those changes happen?
So there's so many aspects that were covered in it, and so perhaps we'll talk about just one or two tied to safety, and we'll hear about how they went about it. We're here in California, of course. You're very familiar with the Three Strikes Law. Now, the Three Strikes Law was implemented in roughly half the states of the United States. In fact, there were three laws that were implemented in the 80s and 90s that drove an explosion in incarceration rate. It increased by a factor of 4 because of the criminalization of drugs. They also had the Three Strikes laws, and the third one, which I can't remember right now. We'll come back to it later. What's that? Mandatory sentencing. Thank you so much. Mandatory sentencing. So we had those three factors. Specifically, Canada identified that Three Strikes laws result in extremely long sentences for people who are committing petty crimes. And so they revised that law decades ago. They learned a lesson, and then they revised it. And that's an example of a country learning from practices. Another practice that was implemented was in the UK, where they banned handguns. And what do we see? we see far lower homicide rates in the UK than in the United States. And that's something for people to pay attention to. There was a time when people understood that the Second Amendment to the Constitution allowed you to bear arms for the protection of the public. There's a phrase in there about the militia. You can't lose that phrase because it doesn't mean that I can build a nuclear weapon in my backyard and I can't walk around with a machine gun right in the middle of Times Square. And so we have to realize there is a control and a natural limitation in arms which exists in other countries, and regardless of our Second Amendment, it still has to exist here. It doesn't mean you ignore the Second Amendment. It means that you read all the words in it, not just the words that you like.
What are your suggested solutions, political, cultural, or otherwise, for narrowing inequality in the U.S.?
Inequality is a very complicated topic because it impacts all of the other areas. It impacts health, with a large disparity in life expectancy. It impacts educational opportunities. It impacts democracy. It impacts every aspect. In terms of creating a situation where we have a higher degree of equality, you have to approach a few things. First, there's corporate governance. There was a time when the CEO to worker ratio was much lower in the United States than it is now. In fact, it used to be about 1/10 the ratio. What happened? Part of it is society decided that it's okay for CEOs to make so much more. And that's a decision by society. Shareholders have to enforce the idea of having a voice. In other countries, such as Germany, they have co-determined boards. Workers sit on the board. Shareholders have a stronger voice. So you have this situation of the income itself, there's a voice to be said in that, as well as at the bottom. Our minimum wage is far lower as a percentage of GDP than other wealthy countries. Someone who works minimum wage in the United States will make roughly 1/3 the GDP per capita. That's a far, far lower rate than in other countries. So raising that minimum wage. At the same time, our tax system controls what you get to keep. And we've made a lot of changes to our tax laws over time. Regardless of however political spectrum you come from, no one can come up with a logical justification for why a hedge fund manager who makes billions of dollars pays 15% in taxes while the rest of the people sitting in this room pay far more. There's no logical justification for it because it's just wrong. And these are just basic things. There's far greater approaches. But at its core, if you want to attempt to account for income inequality, you have to work on where the income comes from. That is, looking at the minimum wage, as well as looking at the maximum wages, and as well as looking at your tax system and your social benefits. So you have to take the complete package and examine it.
If we were to wave a magic wand and pass that federal law on proportional representation, what are your predictions for the big ways in which the political landscape and our system of government would change?
So, now, the proportional representation that I'm referring to, we're specifically talking in the House of Representatives. And it could be the Senate as well, but it won't impact as much. In the House of Representatives, what you would see is, first you'd see third parties now existing. You'd see the end of gerrymandering because it just doesn't mean anything anymore. It would force more cooperation simply because you have to deal with the people from the other side. It also will reduce the amount of extremism. So it has all of those benefits. That's the reality of moving to proportional representation. It also has a side benefit, which is most likely, and I can't promise this, the percentage of legislators who are women will increase. Most experts in democracy identified that the United States has such a low representation because of some of the ramifications of the single-seat winner-take-all election. And in proportional representation, where you use party lists, you have a far more likely chance of having female representatives.
Based on your research, in which country would you most like to live?
I'd like to live in the United States of America. But I want the United States of America to be a great country 50 years from now and 100 years from now. And that's the important thing. Some people, they take a negative spin on this book. They look at it and they say, well, this is America bashing. And it's not America bashing. It's finding ways to identify opportunities for improvement in America so that we can become a greater society. Because I'm trying to look at it from the broader perspective. I'm not talking about what life is going to be like in America 6 months from now or 1 year from now, because these changes take time. But I want to know 1, 2, 3 generations from now, we live in a world which does have a high degree of socioeconomic mobility, in a world where we do have leading health for everyone, not just those who can afford it, where we do have great educational opportunities for everyone, not just those who can afford it. And to me, that's the most critical factor.
Just building on that, what are the biggest strengths America has to draw from and address these issues?
This is the competitive advantages. Where does the United States excel? Because you heard a lot of negatives. I know you did. But there are lots of positives as well. We have leading colleges and universities. We draw the top students from the world to come here. They come for our universities. They come for our graduate schools. They come because of the opportunities for technology. They're fantastic here. They come for the opportunities for entrepreneurship. We have some of the lowest barriers to creating a business of any wealthy country. And so what we need to do is we need to use those competitive advantages, draw the top talent in, and then give them an environment that encourages them to stay, build those great companies here, and also build a home here that is great for everybody. So we take those competitive advantages. And when we talk about health, there's a reason why people who are world leaders come to the United States for that risky surgery, because they trust us as having those great hospitals. Another example of us having the best and bringing it here.
And a final question as we close out. Would you be willing to start a political party dedicated to making the U.S. #1 in each of the 5 categories? You have at least one audience member who says they will support you enthusiastically.
I think I'll just pass on that question. Thank you very much.
You did a great job. Thank you so much.
That concludes our program for this evening. On behalf of the World Affairs Council, I ask you to join me in thanking Howard Friedman for his excellent talk and discussion. I would like to remind you that Mr. Friedman's latest book, The Measure of a Nation, is available for sale courtesy of Books, Inc., and he will be available to sign copies on stage. Thank you and good evening.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
You're fantastic.
Hey, thank you so much. Listen, it was a pleasure meeting you. I gotta give you all.
I read your book, and the statistic I find interesting. The U.S. spends, as you know, approximately 16% of GDP on health, versus most developed countries of 8 to 10%.